Hello, this is a homily for the 19th Sunday of the year, and the theme, among many others, things seems to be that we look at what does faith feel like? Looking from inside ourselves, how do we understand what faith is? And there's a line in the letter to the Hebrews in the second reading. Faith is the realization of what is hoped for, and that's the key realization, that in some little ways we are getting all kinds of glimmerings of what is to come. And celebrating today the Feast of the Transfiguration, we can appreciate perhaps better what the weekend readings are going to mean, because what happened at the Transfiguration was that literally the eyesight of the three apostles was improved through their faith and through God's grace to the point where they could actually see something of who Jesus was. Not everything, but a real dramatic presentation of just who Jesus is as the divine one. And so we're told that our eyes have to look differently. We're realizing what is hoped for, evidence of things not seen in an ordinary sense, but actually beginning to be hinted at, seeing little glimmerings of what's going on, so that we do in fact appreciate, today may be really a bad day, but there is a horizon of joy and hope that keeps me sane, keeps me grounded, even while I am being hassled. And so in the first reading, which is taken from the Book of Wisdom, so figure late, maybe 200 years before Jesus, you have wisdom. Whoever wrote wisdom is encouraging people to have courage. They had some warning of the Passover, and consequently when Passover came, they could appreciate it. They could realize, God really is working. Carrying on there, your people awaited the salvation of the just and the destruction of their foes. For them, given the fact that they were in almost continuous war, don't forget, 2 exiles had already happened to the people who are reading this book. And so they have been used to really serious oppression. And consequently, they can appreciate that God has done these things which could be interpreted another way. Natural events, whatever happened to that army that they went away instead of coming into Jerusalem, and so on and so on. But here they are reading it from, yes, God is making these things happen, because in fact, really, we are in God's hands all the time. In providence, in His providence, so that He wishes and works for the best for us, but then also in specific acts where He reaches into history and makes things happen. So the writer of the Book of Wisdom, in this you glorified us whom you had summoned. Recognizing that, yes, we are at God's call and we are God's people. So we're not just haphazard refugees who get bounced around by the currents of history. We are, in fact, continuously in the hands of God. The psalm, blessed the people the Lord has chosen to be His own. This ties up with that word summoning in the first reading. Blessed the nation whose God is the Lord. Blessed in a real sense that, yes, you are having grace poured out upon you. And you may not realize it sometimes. Other times you may be downright resentful for what God is doing. But God is acting in your history and making your history better. In the second verse, they looked upon the eyes of the Lord to deliver them from death, the great fear, of course, and to preserve them in spite of famine. The other horrible experience that could just hit your people in the blink of an eye. Don't forget the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. So our soul waits for the Lord, and here we have this expansion of the notion of what faith is. Our soul waits for the Lord. Deep inside our spirits, we are calm enough, trusting enough to be able to wait for the Lord to come. Various petitions then follow that, and let me just find the next verse. We go to the second reading, and this is the piece of Hebrews that I quoted earlier. What I didn't mention was that in the letter to the Hebrews, the writer specifically mentions Abraham and his faith, even to the point of essentially agreeing to sacrifice his son. He didn't know that God wouldn't let him sacrifice his son, but he trusted enough. And again, trust, faith in God, all tied in beautifully. The writer also mentions Sarah and the fact of how she became pregnant. Then you have lastly the faith of Isaac, and this is the great family. This is the family that started the Old Testament people of God, and essentially you're going to have the Holy Family starting the New Testament people of God. A lot more there in that letter to the Hebrews, but we are not going to be able to do that. Then we look at the gospel acclamation, and this is taken from Matthew. Stay awake and be ready. Summing up in just different words what we've been hearing all along. Stay awake. Be trusting enough in what is going on, confident enough in God that He hasn't cut us loose. And the next line, you do not know on what day your Lord will come. And that sets up the theme for the gospel reading, which is taken from Luke in this case, Luke chapter 12. Jesus, first of all, encourages them, his disciples, do not be afraid any longer. A fear would be the opposite of faith. And so he starts out with that, and then gives them some practical instructions. Sell your belongings and give alms. Provide money bags for yourself that do not wear out. Because he's not talking about money. He's talking about piling up good deeds, following God's will, so that you will have treasure in heaven. Where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. The heart is that internal metaphor for the internal part of the soul, and if the heart is focused on material things, fine, that's where your faith is going to be. That's where you're going to focus your entire longing and hope. But if your treasure is in God, you focus your longing and your hope in God. Next, gird your loins and light your lamps. Practical, practical, practical stuff. Be like servants who await their master's return from a wedding. If you are ready when your master comes, he will set you down at table and proceed to wait on them. The waiting being, of course, a nice parallel with what happens in John's Gospel, where Jesus, we don't actually hear at the Last Supper about the Eucharist, we hear about Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. So he gives the whole parable, which we're not going to have time to go into, and then Peter asks, is this parable meant for us or for everyone? And Jesus gives them yet another parable. He must have been infuriating sometimes. Talks about the faithful and prudent steward. The faithful and the prudent ones are the ones who are watching for the future, paying attention to what is just over the horizon, because we know He's promised us salvation, and we know it's going to happen. It's going to break into our lives. And that is what the wise and prudent steward does. There's obviously a lot more here, but enough to give us a beautiful image of real, live, active faith, and not simply, well, I believe that God is the Holy Trinity, which is good and beautiful and true, but what am I doing with that? This is a much more active view of faith than simply propositions. Thank you.